In the last three sections, you read about nationalism in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In this section, you'll learn about nationalism and the rise of dictatorships in Latin America during the early 20th century. The Latin American economy at this time was based largely on the export of food and raw materials to the United States and other countries. The Latin American economy. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Latin American economy was based on the export of food and raw materials. The economies of some countries depended on the export of only one or two products. Argentina exported beef and wheat, Chile, nitrates and copper, Brazil and Caribbean nations, sugar, and Central America, bananas. Although a few people made a big profit, most people gained little from these exports. Beginning in the 1920s, the United States began to replace Great Britain as the biggest investor in Latin America. U.S. investors put their funds directly into production companies and ran the companies themselves. As a result, large segments of Latin America's export industries came into U.S. hands. Latin Americans were angry that U.S. investors controlled so many Latin American industries. Many Latin Americans viewed the United States as an imperialist power. They pointed out that profits from U.S. businesses were sometimes used to keep ruthless dictators in power. The United States had intervened militarily in Latin America for years. This was especially true in Central America and the Caribbean. In 1935, however, President Franklin Roosevelt announced the Good Neighbor Policy. This policy rejected the use of U.S. military force in Latin America. Roosevelt withdrew the last U.S. Marines from Haiti in 1936. The Great Depression was a disaster for Latin America's economy. There was a decreased demand for Latin American products and raw materials, especially coffee, sugar, metals, and wheat. The countries that depended on the export of only one product were especially damaged. There was one positive effect, however. With a decline in exports, Latin American countries no longer had the money to buy imported goods. Many Latin American governments encouraged the development of new industries to produce goods that had been previously imported. Governments often invested in the new industries. This led to government-run industries in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. The move to authoritarianism. Most Latin American countries had republican forms of government. In reality, however, a small group of church officials, military leaders, and large landowners dominated each country. They were kept in power by military forces. Military leaders often took control of the government. This trend towards authoritarianism increased during the 1930s, mainly because of the impact of the Great Depression. The trend was especially evident in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Argentina was controlled by an oligarchy, or a government where a select group of people exercises control. This oligarchy of large landowners had grown wealthy from the export of beef and wheat. It did not realize the growing importance of industry in cities. It also ignored the growing middle class. The middle class reacted by forming the Radical Party in 1890. In 1916, Hipólito Yrigoyen, leader of the Radical Party, was elected president of Argentina. The Radical Party was afraid of the industrial workers, who used strikes to improve their conditions. As a result, it drew nearer and closer to the large landowners and became more corrupt. The military was also concerned about the power of the industrial workers. In 1930, the Argentine army overthrew President Yrigoyen and put the large landowners back in power. During World War II, military officers formed a new organization known as the Group of United Officers, or GOU. They were unhappy with the government and overthrew it in June 1943. 3 years later, Juan Perón a GOU member, seized sole power of the country. In Brazil, the army had overthrown the monarchy in 1889 and established a republic. The republic was controlled mainly by the large landowners, who had become wealthy by growing coffee. The Great Depression devastated the coffee industry, and the landowners were no longer able to remain in power. In 1930, a military coup made by Getúlio Vargas, a wealthy rancher, president of Brazil. He ruled from 1930 to 1945. He tried to win the support of workers by establishing an 8-hour workday and a minimum wage. In 1937, Vargas made himself dictator. Beginning in 1938, he established his new state. It was an authoritarian state with some fascist-like features. Political parties were outlawed and civil rights restricted. A secret police used torture against Vargas's enemies. Vargas also encouraged new industries. The government established the Brazilian steel industry and set up a company to explore for oil. Mexico was not an authoritarian state, but it was not truly democratic. The official political party of the Mexican Revolution, known as the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, controlled the major groups in Mexican society. Party bosses of the PRI chose the party's presidential candidate, who was then elected by the people. Change began when Lázaro Cárdenas became president in 1934. He distributed 44 million acres of land to Mexican peasants. He also took a strong hand with the United States, especially over oil. After a dispute over workers' wages, the Cárdenas government seized control of the oil fields and the property of the oil companies. The U.S. oil companies were furious and asked President Roosevelt to intervene. He refused because of the good neighbor policy. Eventually, the Mexican government paid the oil companies for their property. It then set up Pemex, a national oil company. Culture in Latin America. During the early 20th century, European artistic and literary movements began to have an impact on Latin America. In major cities, the wealthy were interested in the work of modern artists. Latin American artists went abroad and brought back modern techniques. Many artists and writers used their work to promote a new national spirit. The Mexican artist Diego Rivera is one example. He used murals. His work were aimed at the masses of people, many of whom could not read. He tried to create a national art that would show Mexico's past and its festivals and folk customs. His work also had a political and social message. Rivera did not want people to forget the Mexican Revolution, which had overthrown large landowners and foreign interests.